Good evening, everyone. I'm Richard Wendorf, the Stanford Calderwood Director and Librarian of the Boston Athenaeum. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you this evening. And I'd like you just to take a moment to double check to see that your cell phones, pagers, and other electronic apparati have been turned off before we have the beginning of our event. Thank you very much. Just so we're in the same key. 3 times in the last 10 years, I've had the opportunity of introducing the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, including twice here at the Athenaeum. So tonight I take great pleasure in introducing his close friend, Meriwether Lewis. The official leader of the epic Lewis and Clark expedition, Lewis has been called undoubtedly the greatest pathfinder this country has ever known. Lewis was born to a Virginia planter family in 1774. His father, who had been an officer in the American Revolution, died when Lewis was 5 years old. And for a brief time, he lived in Georgia when his mother moved there with her second husband. After briefly assuming the management of his family's Virginia plantation, Lewis joined the state militia in 1794 to help put down the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania. He continued his military career as an officer in the regular army, serving on the frontier in Ohio and Tennessee, and rising to the rank of captain by 1801, when he accepted an invitation from Thomas Jefferson, an old family friend, to serve as his private secretary. Jefferson seems to have selected Lewis for this post with a view to placing him in charge of an already contemplated transcontinental expedition. When Jefferson had proposed such an expedition in 1792, Lewis had been among the first volunteers, although his youth and inexperience disqualified him at that time. Now, with his frontier experience, Lewis made a perfect candidate in Jefferson's eyes, and the president soon set out on a course of study that would equip him with the scientific skills needed for his journey. Between 1801 and the appropriation of funds for the expedition in 1803, Lewis studied with members of the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania and gathered information about his proposed route, beginning his journey later that year. The rest, as they say, is history. Please join me in welcoming Meriwether Lewis to the Boston Athenaeum.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, and I particularly was delighted to hear you speak of me as, in some eyes, the foremost explorer in American history. I can't claim that title, although that's precisely how I wanted to be remembered. At a key moment in my 28-month tour, I likened myself to Captain Cook and to Columbus, and acknowledged that our fleet was smaller than that of Columbus, and our ambitions were less than those of Captain James Cook, but we still had as much pride in our voyage as they certainly must have in theirs. And I bring you greetings on behalf of the President of the United States, and I will only quibble with one small piece of your introduction to say this, that Mr. Jefferson hired me in the spring of 1801 to serve as his aide-de-camp and his private secretary. And his reason, he may have been thinking of my later tour, but his reason stated at the time was that he wanted to reduce the size of our army in the West. He had campaigned on the principle that our armed forces were too large, and so he wanted an officer who knew something about the officer corps so that we could decide which officers in the Army to keep on in Mr. Jefferson's administration and which to retire to private life. And I actually made a long grid of each officer and his capacities, both in the military sense and in a civilian sense, and also, I must say, their political affiliations for Mr. Jefferson. And this enabled him to fulfill his pledge to reduce the size of the Army. But it's true that for over a decade, I had been panting after this tour. I later called it a darling project of mine for the last 10 years. And at the moment when finally I was able to put one foot on either side of the source of the Missouri River in your Montana, I regarded that as perhaps the happiest day of my life. But let me back up and say, too, that I am hoping for a generous reception here. Mr. Jefferson warned me that I might not get it in New England. When Mr. Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory from Bonaparte, the greatest land sale in human history, $15.6 million for 828,000 square miles, 3 cents per acre, for what the president called an empire for liberty such as the world has never previously seen. The Federalists of your district decried the purchase. One Federalist newspaper called it the wildest chimera of a moonstruck brain. And a Federalist politician said, Mr. Jefferson, without congressional authorization, have spent money which we don't have for land which we don't need. And after my tour, the Connecticut poet Joel Barlow suggested that the Columbia River be renamed the Lewis River in my honor. I was really shy about that, and I didn't think that it was a particularly good idea, but your own favorite son, John Quincy Adams, wrote a satire in the public papers, making fun not only of that suggestion, making fun of Barlow and his politics, but decrying Mr. Jefferson and speaking of Mr. Jefferson's obsession with Dusky Sally. So that's the sort of reception I have been led to believe I would receive here. The object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and such principal streams of it as by its course and communication with the waters of the Pacific Ocean shall afford the most direct and practicable water communication across this continent for the purposes of commerce. In other words, Mr. Jefferson's instruction was that I would lead a party of men from the mouth of the Missouri near St. Louis all the way up to its source, wherever that might be. Nobody had been there before. Having reached the source of that great river, I was to cross over the intervening ridge of mountains. We did not know how high, how broad, how many ranges we would encounter. And then find navigable waters of the Columbia system, make my way down to the Pacific Ocean, and come back again safely. That was the mission. And I'm proud to say that we fulfilled it without significant difficulty. Only one of our men was lost. His name was Charles Floyd. He was one of the so-called 9 young men from Kentucky, and he died early on in the course of the expedition of natural causes on August 20th, 1804. We buried him with full military honors, elected a sergeant in his place, Patrick Gass, and proceeded on. He was our only casualty. The rest of us were ill from time to time. William Bratton nearly died of a back injury, a slipped disc, perhaps. I was wounded on the return journey. I will come back to that later. Nathaniel Pryor had his shoulder dislocated 3 times. There were cuts and scrapes and terrible digestive problems, but Floyd was the only death. I should say that on the return journey in 1806, we killed 2 Indians. Mr. Jefferson had made it clear that he wanted us to bend over backwards to conciliate the Indians, to treat them with the greatest generosity of spirit, to inform them that we had not purchased their land in fee simple, that we had merely bought the right of first negotiation from France and from Spain. He wanted us to encourage peace amongst the tribes and to hope that they would accelerate their cultural pace into sedentary agriculture. He wanted to create conditions of trade for what we had in surplus in exchange for what they might have in surplus, their furs for our kettles and beads and needles and awls and scissors. And he urged me to suggest to the Indians that if they would live under the security umbrella of the United States, that we could hasten their time in which they would enjoy the blessings of European civilization. If they wished to send some of their children to live amongst us, we would raise them in our way. And we wanted, above all, said Mr. Jefferson, to do justice by these indigenous peoples. So he would have been disappointed, of course, to learn that on the return journey, at dawn on the morning of July 27, 1806, in Upper Montana, to use one of your terms, we had a skirmish with 8 Blackfeet boys. We had encountered them. I had just 3 men with me, so we were numbering 4 at this time on a small side trip. We encountered 8 Blackfeet. We were not eager to have an interview with them, but we felt that we now must, because if there were 8 there were 80 nearby and 800 within a day's march. And so we bivouacked with them and spent an evening feasting with them, and I gave a version of my speech to them. But at dawn the following morning, they attempted to steal our guns and our horses. And in the little skirmish that followed, unfortunately, we killed 2 of them. One I shot while he was attempting to take our horse herd, and the other was killed by a knife by one of my best men, Reuben Field. That was the only bloodshed of the entire journey. I regret it, but we acted in self-defense. So one of us died, Charles Floyd, August 20th, 1804, and 2 Indians died, July 27th, 1806. Altogether, we traveled 7,689 miles, about 15 miles per day. We wintered 3 times, once at the mouth of the Missouri at a place we called Camp Wood, built on the Illinois side, because the formal transfer of the territory had not yet occurred. That was the winter of 1803-1804. The second year, the first formal year of travel, we ascended the Missouri from its mouth to its great bend in what is now North Dakota. And there we spent 5 months amongst an ingenious group of Earth Lodge peoples, the Mandan and the Hidatsa. Now these peoples don't roam about the country like the Sioux or the Cheyenne. They live in semi-permanent Earth Lodge villages. They have zoning systems and the rudiments of culture. And there were 4,500 of them at this bend of the Missouri. And we built a little compound at the base of these 5 Earth Lodge villages. We called it Fort Mandan and spent 5 months there. It was the coldest experience that any of us had ever had. The temperature was often 20 degrees below zero. Occasionally it was 40 degrees below zero. The wind blew like a son of a bitch. And the coldest was, I believe, December 9th, 1804, 45 degrees below zero with a stiff wind from the Hudson's Bay. We were not miserable, but we were frequently cold. In Dakota, our whiskey froze, a thing we thought impossible. Several of our thermometers burst from the cold. One day I was sitting at my desk writing a report for Mr. Jefferson, and it was about 9 a.m. and just breathtakingly cold outside. And the sergeant at guard came in and said, "Mr. Lewis, you must come outside because there is a strange celestial phenomenon. There are 3 suns in the sky." And so I went out and looked, and there in the southeastern sky was the pitiful little sun hovering above the horizon, and on either side of itself, crystalline reflections, the so-called sundogs or parhelion. So I described this in my journal for that day, but the Indians of this district had a much better story for this. They said, "Father, it is so cold in Dakota that the sun lights little fires for itself to stay warm." When we first arrived at this set of villages, a chief from the lower Mandan village, the village called Mitun-Tonka, and the chief we called Big White or White Coyote, Sheheka, he came to visit us. He came across the Missouri River in a bullboat with his wife, and he brought us a hospitality gift of 140 pounds of buffalo flesh. He brought this on the back of his woman, and he carried just his pipe and his pouch of tobacco. Such are gender relations amongst the Mandan. And he put these buffalo parcels in front of us, and he gave us a speech, and this is what he said, and it was one of the extraordinary moments of our expedition. He said, "Father, it is cold in Dakota. We frequently suffer, but I will make this pledge to you. If we eat in abundance this winter, you will share our good fortune. But if we go hungry, you must agree to starve alongside with us." And these extraordinary Mandan were equal to this pledge, and our winter amongst them was both fascinating, comfortable, and in many regards very satisfying. And after the expedition was over, we made a list of the Indians we particularly admired and those we didn't admire much. The Sioux were at the bottom. We called them the vilest miscreants of the savage race. The Blackfeet were right amongst them, but amongst the Indians that we greatly admired, the Mandan, the Nez Perce, the Walla Walla, the Flatheads. So the first winter at the mouth of the Missouri, the second winter at this great bend, and we left Fort Mandan on April 7th, 1805. At that point, we sent back our keel boat. Our original main vessel was a 55-foot barge, we called it a keel boat. It drew 3 feet of water. We were traveling with about 20 tons of luggage at the beginning, but that boat was too bulky to go on. In fact, it had been difficult to get it even that far up the river. So we sent it back down with reports and letters to our families and friends, and several men discharged for bad behavior, and live specimens for the president, and artifacts, some of which eventually found their way here to Boston. And we concocted 6 Cottonwood dugout canoes to replace the keel boat. We also had 2 pirogues. These are flat-bottomed boats, large, wide, flat-bottomed canoes. We had a red pirogue and a white pirogue. So our new fleet, beginning in April of 1805, is this group of 6 dugouts and the 2 original wooden boats, these pirogues. And this is what I wrote on that occasion, April 7th, 1805. I felt then, as we left the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa, that in a sense we were walking off the map. Because up till that point, from St. Louis to these villages, was country that had been traveled before by Europeans. Perhaps as many as a dozen white people had been that far up the Missouri before, and they had mapped it and described it, and the tributaries had been named. And so in a sense, that first year of travel from May 1804 till October 1804 was through relatively familiar country. And the sense of discovery was therefore diminished. But now, in leaving these villages, we were walking off the known world into terra incognita. And literally every time now that we came around a bend in the river, we would be seeing something that had never been seen before in the history of the world by somebody possessing an alphabet. And so we were the first to see this country. And we would name it, and we would map it, and we would discover new quadrupeds and new plants. And so we were very full of expectation as we left these villages. And this is what I wrote in my journal, April 7th, 1805. Our vessels consist of 6 small canoes and 2 large pirogues. This little fleet, although perhaps not quite so respectable as those of Columbus or Captain Cook, were still viewed by us with as much pleasure as those deservedly famed adventurers ever beheld theirs, and I dare say with as much anxiety for their safety and preservation. We are now about to penetrate a country at least 2,000 miles in width, upon which the foot of civilized man has never trodden. The good or evil it has in store for us is for experiment to determine, and this little fleet contains every article by which we are to expect to subsist or defend ourselves. Entertaining as I do the most confident hope of succeeding in a voyage which has formed a darling project of mine for the last 10 years, I could not but look upon this moment as amongst the most happy of my life. The men are in excellent health and spirits, zealously attached to the enterprise and eager to proceed. Not a murmur or a whisper of discontentment is to be heard among them, but all act in unison and with the most perfect harmony. I took an early supper this evening and went to bed. April 7th, 1805. The key sentence, of course, we were now about to penetrate a country at least 2,000 miles in width upon which the foot of civilized man had never trodden. And I cannot begin to describe to you the sublimity of what we saw. We would come up over a bluff and we would look down at 10,000 buffalo. And then an hour later on another bluff, 20,000. Infinite numbers of antelope, elk, mule deer, white-tailed deer, jackrabbits, bighorn sheep. These creatures were so thick in your Montana that when we walked on shore, we sometimes had to part them with the end of our gun stocks. They would just stand there looking at us. I said in my diary that if Clark and I walked on the shore for 15 minutes one morning, we could feed a regiment for a week. I had to warn the men not to kill too much. It was just so tempting. The coyotes and the wolves of the district didn't even bother to hunt. They just walked behind these immense herds and waited for something to drop. The buffalo were seemingly infinite in numbers. They were like locusts, only 2,000 pounds apiece. I reckoned, keeping statistics for Mr. Jefferson, that each day to feed our company of 33, the permanent party numbered 33, including, of course, one woman now, but to feed that company, it took a buffalo a day, or 4 deer, or an elk and a deer. But it was as if the easiest thing in the world to keep us well fed there. And we came to places that, because nobody had ever seen them before, we must name. So we named a river in your Montana the Dearborn, after the Secretary of War, and another the Smith, after the Secretary of Navy. And when we came to the place where the Missouri forked into 3 co-equal branches, and no one could any longer justly be called the Missouri, we named one the Gallatin, after the Secretary of the Treasury, and another the Madison, after Mr. Jefferson's closest friend and the Secretary of State, James Madison. And of course the principal stream, the stream we intended to ascend to the source itself, we named the Jefferson. And when the Jefferson forked into 3 co-equal branches, we named one philosophy, another philanthropy, and a third wisdom, after the cardinal virtues of my patron. And so we mapped this country for the first time in human history. We attempted to ascertain latitude and longitude at all key places on our tour. Latitude easy, longitude exceedingly difficult. We named the tributaries and the features of the landscape. You know, one day we named a river something or other, and Clark came to me later and he said, "My friend, I wonder if you would allow me a small indulgence. I should like to rename this river the Judith, after a young woman of whom I am enamored back in Virginia." And so we named that river the Judith, and I'm told it bears that name even in your time. So now I felt a certain pressure upon myself, and a few days later when we came to a bold stream, I decided to name it the Marias, after one Maria Wood, and I wrote in my journal, "This shallow, brackish, and fetid stream, although it does not have the pure celestial virtues of that fair one, is nevertheless destined to become a bone of contention between Great Britain and the United States with respect to the fur trade. And perhaps Miss Wood will not mind terribly much if I name this river politely in her honor." Such was Montana. So we're discovering a new world, and it is full of interesting creatures. In the course of our expedition, we discovered for binomial science 178 new plant species. We also discovered 122 new animals, including the bighorn sheep and the pronghorn antelope and the jackrabbit and the mule deer. But most interesting, we met more than 50 different Indian tribes, 24 of which we reckoned were first encounter. They had never seen a white man of any description before. We were the first. And we brought back as much data as we possibly could. Mr. Jefferson, as you know, is particularly interested in native cultures. He has theories about the indigenous peoples and their languages. He has philanthropic views of their future. And he wanted us to bring back ethnographic data of the fullest sort. And in his wisdom, Mr. Jefferson had made a chart, had printed it, of 250 common words: husband, wife, birth, death, sun, moon, stars, a basic vocabulary in English. And he asked me, whenever we stopped for any significant length of time, to take down a vocabulary of the tribe that we were visiting. And we dutifully did this and brought back 23 new vocabularies of Indian tribes. Those papers were eventually lost, I'm sorry to say. Not under my watch, under Mr. Jefferson's. But we took down these vocabularies dutifully, and it was very difficult. I can give you a sense of how difficult it was. We had almost no interpreters. We couldn't take interpreters because when you're making first encounters, no such beings exist. And so when we would get to these tribes, take, for example, the Nez Perce. The Nez Perce had never seen a white man before. They, of course, didn't speak English. We didn't speak Nez Perce. So how would then you take down this vocabulary? Indeed, how would you tell them of Mr. Jefferson's philanthropic views of the future? So the problem of translation was a fundamental one. I can give you the worst case scenario. This was amongst the Nez Perce. I would give my speech in English. We come in peace for all mankind. And this was translated from English into French by a man named Francois Labiche. Then it was translated from French into Hidatsa by Toussaint Charbonneau, a trader we encountered in Dakota. Then translated from Hidatsa into Shoshone by his woman, Sakagarwea, the famous Sakagarwea. Then translated from Shoshone into Nez Perce by a 16-year-old boy. So I would say we come in peace for all mankind in English, and then it would go to French, Hidatsa, Shoshone, and Nez Perce. It sometimes took 5 or 6 hours to give my basic speech. And it was very tedious business. And it wasn't clear to me that Mr. Jefferson's Pax Americana found its way successfully across so many linguistic barriers. Charbonneau, for example, barely spoke French. And yet he was our conduit. Then when we would take down vocabularies, I would say, well, what's their word for moon? And we'd go from English to French and French to Hidatsa and Hidatsa to Shoshone and Shoshone to Nez Perce, and there'd be a long pause, and then it would come back, and the answer would be, well, full moon or half moon. We were attempting to use the Roman alphabet to take down these sounds: Sakagarwea, Kamiawait, Posakapsahe, Shaheka, trying to get their words down and transcribe them accurately. It was exceedingly difficult. We had one advantage. We did have George Drouillard, who was our master hunter and trailsman, and he was an expert in the sign language, that lingua franca of the Plains tribes. This gesticulation language you would think would be highly primitive, but in fact I discovered that for simple communications about food and shelter and peace and war and geography, it's actually more effective than translation tends to be. And so in the course of the expedition, all of us learned a little bit of this sign. So that was the linguistic issue. This Montana phase was a discovery phase. I won't go into greater detail except to say that this was the headiest time, when I felt most like Captain Cook, when I felt that I was fulfilling Mr. Jefferson's Enlightenment program most significantly. We had learned from the Hidatsa, who were those Dakota Earth Lodge peoples, who every year raided out towards the Rocky Mountains. We had learned that there would be a great falls of the Missouri. And we knew this because we were students of geography, and as you know, all great rivers have a fall line. The James has its fall line at Richmond, and the Potomac has its falls at Georgetown, and the Ohio has its falls at Louisville. Every great river has this place where it tumbles out of the mountains onto the plain, and that fall line is frequently a key navigational point. So we expected it, and the Hidatsa had told us that this falls was magnificent. And I had a habit in the course of our tour of wanting to go on ahead at the moments of key discovery so that I could be the first civilized man to see this or that. And I made up an excuse to go ahead in mid-June to see these great falls, and I arrived there on the 13th of June, 1805, with just a couple of men with me. And I had seen the falls before I heard them because there were mists coming up on a perfectly clear day and rainbow effects. And then I heard the sound of thunder, and I came up over this ridge, and I looked down, and there it was, I would say the most magnificent thing that I ever saw in the whole course of my life. I would go farther and say, at the very least, the second most sublime place in North America, with the possible exception of Niagara, and maybe better. And so I scrambled down, and I found a rock just below these falls, and I took out my notebook, and I prepared to write the first description in the history of the world of this place. And I wrote out a 500-word description, partly scientific and partly poetic. The falls consist of really two phases. For two-thirds, it's an orgiastic mass of tumbling water, chaos and madness, and it gives you a sense of the littleness of man. But for the last third, the water comes over this ledge like a mirror, like a sheet of pure, majestic, serene glass. That's why I described all of that. And I described the eagles and the vultures flying in their thermal patterns overhead. And it was still spring. It was still the spring run on the Missouri. And so creatures that had drowned somewhere upriver were coming down. Buffalo that would drown for one reason or another, falling through the ice or being pushed in by their colleagues. They would bloat up in the Montana sun. And they came over the falls like corks and just tumbled and were dashed into 1,000 pieces at the base of the falls. I described all of that, and then I looked up to the thing itself. And I immediately realized that my description was pitiful and wholly inadequate. That this was my moment. I had been sent here by the president to be his eyes and ears, to be the pen of discovery. And whatever impression I brought back would be the world's first impression of this place. And if it were magnificent, the world would apprehend that magnificent, and if it were pitiful, as it was, the world might not know of the grandeur of the great falls of the Missouri. And so I had no means to capture this moment. I was so upset with myself that I thought of crossing out my first description and starting again, but then I realized that my second or my third would be no better, probably, and arguably worse. And I wish that I had the painting capacity of Titian or Salvador Rosa, or the poetic talents of James Thomson, the Scottish nature poet, or Mr. Jefferson's famous facility with prose. But I had none of these. I wish that at least I had a camera obscura, a kind of a silhouetting device, so that I could trace the falls and bring back something to give to a more competent artist in Philadelphia. But I hadn't that either. I was a man alone at the most magnificent place in North America with a blank sheet of paper and a pen. And what I discovered there was that the West is mightier than the pen, or mightier than mine, and it filled me with a sense of failure and despair. And if you know my story, you know that I never wrote my book after the expedition. And I believe that in some part my confidence in being Mr. Jefferson's muse there was hurt by my inability on that occasion, June 13th, 1805. Well, Patrick Gass, the three sergeants were also required to keep journals, and Patrick Gass was one of them, and he came and saw this, and he may have been impressed, but when he realized that the portage of our now 10 tons of luggage would be 18 3/4 miles around this set of falls, he described the great falls of the Missouri in his diary with just 2 words: very terrible. And 1 month later, I had the joy of drinking from the source of the Missouri itself. And again, I had pressed on ahead of everybody else. And I wrote in my diary, at the distance of 4 miles farther, the road took us to the most distant fountain of the Missouri River, in search of which We have spent so many toilsome days and restless nights. Thus far, I had accomplished one of those grand objects upon which my mind has been unalterably fixed for many years. Judge then of the pleasure I felt in slaking my thirst with this pure and ice-cold water, which issued from the base of a low mountain or high hill. And I said I was traveling with an Irishman named Hugh McNeil. I said 2 miles below, McNeil had stood with one foot on either side of this little rivulet and thanked his God that he had lived to bestride the mighty and heretofore deemed endless Missouri River. And on that same day, I climbed up over a little ridge and drank from the waters of the Columbia River. I had, as it were, knitted together this continent in my digestive tract. I won't linger much longer. I want to take some time for your questions, but I want to describe what may have been the most important single moment of the expedition. For me, of course, the source of the Missouri, the Great Falls, starting out from Fort Mandan. But in terms of Mr. Jefferson, the great moment would be getting over the Rocky Mountains, because what we learned as we traveled upriver is that they are, in fact, much higher than the Appalachians. Mr. Jefferson was wrong when he said that the Western Mountains would be parallel to the Appalachians and certainly no higher. We discovered that they were almost twice as high and very formidable indeed. There was no Cumberland Gap. There was no simple way through. And at the end, when I got back, I held up the mails in St. Louis and sent a preliminary report to Mr. Jefferson in which I said that the distance between navigable waters of the Missouri and navigable waters of the Columbia is about 350 miles. 150 or so through almost impenetrable mountains, and 60 at least mountains which have snow 12 months per year. And so there is no simple Northwest Passage. There's no Cumberland Gap. That Mr. Jefferson's dream of a water artery that would link the continent, Atlantic to Pacific, is a chimera. But we had to get over those mountains or our mission would fail, and we had all this luggage, and we couldn't carry it on our backs. And so we knew that we were going to need horses. And back in Dakota, when we were amongst these Hidatsa, we actually hired this woman, Sakagarwea, for this express purpose, because her husband, Toussaint Charbonneau, came to us and offered his services as translator. And although we didn't much respect him, we hired him, and he said, "You're not going to be able to get all this across the mountains unless you have horses, and I can tell you who the horse people are. They're the Shoshone, the snakes, and I happen to have this woman who's a snake, and if you take us with you, when the moment comes, she will help you to negotiate for the horses that you need to cross those mountains." And so we hired him, and he brought her. He was going to bring both of his Shoshone wives. In the end, he just brought the one, and her purpose was to help us when that moment came. So we saw it as absolutely critical to make successful contact with these Shoshone and then to negotiate for pack horses. The problem was this, that the Shoshone were victims of an arms race. The British from Canada, the Hudson's Bay traders and the Northwest Company traders, had been giving guns to the enemies of the Shoshone, the Blackfeet and the Yatsena and the Assiniboine, and those gun-toting Indians were lording it over everybody else. And the Shoshone had few or no guns, and they were victims, and they were now a refugee people living up in the Bitterroot Mountains and eating grasses and digging roots and nearly starved. I mean, literally. When I saw the chief Kamiawait, his face was just lank and emaciated from the sacrifices that he had made. And so we had to make contact with the people who were scared of everything. And if we didn't make contact with them, I felt that the expedition might collapse altogether. So I asked through interpreters, this Sakagarwea, what I should say to reconcile these people to us. And the phrase that came back to me as best I could understand it was ta-ba-bone. Ta-ba-bone. And, said this Sakagarwea, if I took a blanket and unfurled it ritualistically 3 times onto the ground, that this was a sign of peaceful intentions. So ta-ba-bone, unfurled the blanket. Well, thus equipped, with just 3 men, I set out in search of the Shoshone. We had several near misses where I would see one from a couple of miles off and shout, "Tababone!" But they always turned and fled. And I later learned that tababone means stranger, which, if you think about it, might not be the best term for a people who are scared of everybody, but it's all that I had. And one of my men failed me by I had men flanking me, one a mile on this side and one a mile on this side, and Hugh McNeil next to me with his gun holding up an American flag, and we thus marched into this set of coves in the Bitterroot Mountains. And one of the men didn't see a signal, and he scared off a Shoshone, and I must say I upbraided him very severely for that breach. But finally, we came up over a little knoll, and there were 3 Shoshone women digging roots, an elderly woman, a girl of about 12, and a woman in her 20s. And they were down in the grass, and they hadn't seen us coming, and we were too close really for them to do much. The woman in her 20s sprinted off, but the other 2 were frozen in fear in the fetal position. And it was clear that they had reconciled themselves to whatever might come. And so I walked up to the elderly woman, and I lifted her out of the grass and into the standing position and said, "Tababone, tababone." And I happened to have some vermilion paint in a little canister in my necessary bag, and I took it out and I painted her tawny cheeks with it. And then I took the girl, the child, and lifted her up and painted her cheeks. And then I signaled through George Druyer, the sign man, to tell the woman who was running away to call her back. And to my great astonishment, she came back, and I painted her tawny cheeks. And I had some trinkets, some mirrors and some curtain rings and some needles and awls and scissors, and I gave them this tuck. And then I said, in the way of all explorers, "Take us to your leader." So now I'm feeling very confident because there are 4 of us and 3 of them, and they seem delighted with these trinkets, and we're on our way to their leader, and I think perhaps the expedition is going to succeed. But at that precise moment, around a corner, came 60 heavily armed Shoshone warriors on horseback, bow and arrow ready, galloping, armed cap a pie, and it was clear that they were coming for us, that we had been seen. And they pulled up at about 30 yards away, and I realized that I was now in the defining moment of my life. So I handed Hugh McNeil my rifle, and I pulled up my sleeve so I could show what little pale flesh I still had, because I was dressed like this, like an Indian, and although I was shaving as an officer, so I looked like an Indian. I was as tan as any Indian. We were eating what Indians eat and sleeping where Indians sleep. It was hard to tell that I was a civilized man. I looked like an Indian. I was acting more or less like an Indian. How could I tell these savages that I knew Latin? That I knew the difference between Bordeaux and Burgundy? That I could do Linnaean binomial classification of plants? That I was the friend and aide de camp to the most enlightened man in the world? And so there was a sense of futility in this. I pulled up my sleeve and I walked up to shake hands saying, "Tababone, tababone." Well, fortunately, one of these women spoke rapidly to the leaders, and they realized that whatever else was true, we were not immediately a threat. And so the chief of the tribe got down, and his name I later learned was Kamiawait. He came up and I offered to shake his hand, but he wouldn't shake my hand because they don't shake hands. They have this strange hug instead. And what they do is he took his left arm and put it over my right shoulder and snugged me up as tight into his body as it is possible for a human being to be snugged. Now keep in mind, he's naked. He's as naked as the day he was born. He has a little breech clout on, and that's it. And he has painted his body with pigments of oil and bear's grease and star patterns and so on. So he has snugged me into him. And we are so close as to be somewhat uncomfortable. And once he has me there, he begins to move up and down like this. And then he began to vociferate the following phrase: "Ahai! Ahai! which I later learned means I am much rejoiced, I am much pleased. So on the one hand, I felt quite good about this because it had disarmed a potentially difficult situation, but for the rest of the day, whenever I said anything even slightly agreeable, Camiawait and his principal leaders would line up and give me this hug until as I put it in my journal, I became begreased and besmeared and heartily tired of the national hug of the Shoshone people. Well, I won't go into detail, but I managed to communicate to him that Clark and the boats were just behind, coming up to the end of navigation, maybe 30 miles away, and that if these Shoshone would bring horses down, we could bring the luggage to their camp and then negotiate for the purchase of horses. And this was the most difficult single week of my life because they wanted to scamper. They wanted to run away. They didn't trust me. They felt that I was leading them into an ambush. It was almost impossible for me to hold these Shoshone with me and to convince them to come with me back down to the head of navigation. And I nearly lost them 5 or 6 times, and if you read my journal, it's just full of despair and anxiety. But I finally said, when we get to the head of navigation, there will be a note in a tree. I'd left one for Clark saying, this is as far as you can take the boats. I said, come there and Clark will be waiting. We got to that spot and there was no Clark. And I realized that I was losing Camiawait. And so I did 2 things that I never expected to do. I gave him my hat. I had 2 tokens left of being a civilized man. I had this gorgeous hat, big round military hat with a white plume. It's one of the last things that I had that had been manufactured, and I was wearing it. And I took this hat off and I put it on his head. And he had this extraordinary otter and ermine skin tippet, the most beautiful Indian robe that I ever saw. I later purchased it. And he took it off of his shoulders and put it on mine. So you see where this is headed. If it's an ambush, I'm the Indian. So he's wearing my hat, I'm wearing his tippet. And then, in utter necessity, I did something that I had vowed that I would never in the course of my life do. I took my rifle and I handed it to him and made it clear through sign that if it was an ambush, he could shoot me first. And I looked at him. And I looked at myself. And I realized, to my horror, that I had become completely metamorphosed, that I had become an Indian. And that in the course of my journey, layer after layer after layer of the thin veneer of civilization had gone. Our clothes had literally rotted off of our backs. Our processed food was long since gone. And I had been stripped of everything that is a token of being civil and had been reduced to elemental status like King Lear. And now I had become a perfect Indian and I was completely metamorphosed. And I must tell you, I did not find that satisfying. I found it deeply and fundamentally upsetting. We made contact with Clark, and I'll just close with this and then take a few of your questions. We made contact with Clark, and I was so relieved because at that point we began to negotiate for these Shoshone horses. We needed about 50, but we had to settle for 29, and they were none too good, but we got enough to get over the mountains. But in order to negotiate, finally it was Sacagawea's moment. We had carried her all this way for this purpose, and now her moment came, and so they had one tent left, one teepee. That's all they had in their whole tribe, but it seated about 50. It was a big ceremonial tent. And we sat down, and they made us take our moccasins off as a sign of peaceful intentions, and we had an endless pipe ceremony invoking the 4 quarters and the Great Spirit and the Earth Mother, and we all smoked to our satisfaction. And this went on really for more than an hour. And finally, it was time to say, we need horses to cross the mountains. And so I said it in English, and now Sacagawea's moment came. So the chief is over here on my left, Camiawait, and here's Sacagawea here. She's an Indian woman, so she's shy and downcast. She's covered with almost entirely with a blanket, and she's not making any eye contact. But her moment has come. So she finally looks up to translate for me, and across at this chief, Camiawait, and you can have no idea what she discovered. She discovered at that instant that the chief was her brother. Now, she had been captured from this very clan 5 years previously by Hidatsa warriors. They had raided out into the Three Forks area. They had taken her back to Dakota. She had been married to this Charbonneau, this rascal. Undoubtedly, her own people thought she was dead or gone forever. Now suddenly she's back after 5 years, not only in her tribe, but her clan, and the chief is her brother. It was the most extraordinary coincidence that I ever saw in the whole course of my life or read about. And so she burst into tears. And she ran over with her blanket and threw it over her brother, and they were under the blanket for some time weeping and having this reunion. And then she tried to gather herself, and she went back to translate, and then they burst into tears again, and she went back, and they were under the blanket for another period of time. And I have to say, it was very affecting and moving. We were all moved by this coincidence and this reunion. But I can also remember thinking, we're probably going to get the horses. And we did. We got the horses, and they got us over the Bitterroot Mountains, and it was a terrible, terrible difficulty. We truly nearly starved, and we were a pitiful-looking group when we got through. And then we built dugouts and rushed recklessly down the Clearwater and the Snake and the Columbia to the ocean. And Clark wrote on November 7th, 1805, "Ocean in view, oh, the joy." And I will only say this much about the homecoming. We had done it. We had fulfilled the mission. We had crossed the continent with the loss of only one man. The problem was this, that we had hoped for resupply. And Mr. Jefferson, in his genius, had produced for me a universal letter of credit that I could spend anywhere on earth at any time for any purchases, and the bills would just be sent to the White House. So this was a blank check for resupply, perhaps to send journals around the Cape, to send some of the men back. We could all come back this way, but we could buy medicines and clothing and Indian trade items and gifts and anything we needed. But the problem is, of course, we didn't meet a trade boat at the mouth of the Columbia. And so on March 23rd, 1806, we had to turn back and go all that way again. But this time, we were bankrupt. I mean, literally. At the beginning, we had 14 bales of Indian gifts and trade goods, and those bales would be about the size of this table. And on the return journey, Clark said on March 23rd, 1806, that everything we now had to trade or give away could be contained in 2 handkerchiefs. So for ferrying services, for guiding services, for horses, for you name it, whatever we now need has to be purchased with 2 handkerchiefs filled with rusty things. And so getting back was very, very difficult indeed. But we did it. And we arrived safely on September 23rd, 1806. And I held up the mails and I reported our success to the President of the United States. Well, I have only touched the surface of this, but I wanted to leave a little time for questions. I assume you will tell me when I have no more time, but let me take a few questions. Sir, you begin. Well, I'd be happy to stay till midnight if you like. I have not even adequately told part 1, and I haven't mentioned grizzly bears, for example, and our nearly fatal confrontation with the Teton Sioux. And twice in 4 days we came, within a hair's breadth of a melee. And I haven't mentioned the horrors of the Missouri River. It is a very capricious stream. The banks fall in, and the bottom is unsound, so you can't use setting poles. And when the wind blows from the wrong direction, you simply have to stop. And the water is so murky you can't see what's under the surface, and it's frequently a sawyer, a tree that's embedded in the bottom, and it's sawing up and down and can puncture a hole in the keelboat in a second. So the river itself was a terrible business, and I could go on and on about any number of subjects, and I just don't have time to do it. So I must confine myself pretty dramatically, but I will tell you this much, that we felt that our mission was very successful. We made discoveries on behalf of science. We had a better success rate for the preservation of our men than could reasonably have been expected. We expected to lose a number of men. We had the best medical kit that the world offered. Dr. Rush had provided it for me, Benjamin Rush, Mr. Jefferson's friend, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. We were extremely well equipped with armaments. We had the finest arsenal that a military expedition could be expected to carry at the time. We had extraordinary journals. We've been called the writingest explorers of all time. In fact, I believe 7, but certainly 6 of our men kept journals, and 5 of those 6 are extant in your time. So we felt that we had really done very well indeed. But the return journey was very difficult, and it was something of a letdown in many regards. Yes, sir. And this allows me to go back to the beginning of the other question, too, to talk about distances. Well, basically, we worked by dead reckoning. And by that I mean this, that Clark would be sitting on the keelboat or the white pirogue, and he would look at the next bend of the river, and he would say, that Cottonwood is about 1.5 miles. And when we got there, then he'd say, that cliff is about 2 miles. And after a few weeks, we read the country very well. Clark was a gifted cartographer. You know, cartography is both a science and an art, and Clark had both. In fact, when I came back, I said to Mr. Jefferson, if there are rewards to be had from a grateful nation, then I simply insist that Clark be rewarded as fully as myself, and Clark was. So dead reckoning. We also were using latitude and longitude. Now, I won't go into detail because this is quite tedious, but you can tell latitude anywhere on Earth merely by measuring the angle between the horizon and the sun at meridian. And a simple computation and a consultation of an almanac, and we had a small traveling library with us. This tells you without any question the latitude. Longitude is much more difficult. You know, latitude is where you are north and south from the equator, parallel lines. Longitude is converging lines from the poles with the baseline at Greenwich. And if you have a timepiece set to Greenwich Mean Time, you can tell your longitude simply anywhere on Earth, but we couldn't do that, even though the largest expense we had in the original appropriation of $2,500, 1/10 of it went to our chronometer, but the chronometer proved to be highly unreliable. And so we couldn't count on that. We couldn't keep something set to Greenwich time. Now, you can reset to Greenwich time in the wilderness, but it is extremely difficult. So we were stuck. So what we did instead was the second method, the observational method. And in this, you create an artificial horizon, and then you examine the moon as against fixed stars, or the moons of Jupiter as they come out from behind the planet of Jupiter. And this requires extremely painstaking and accurate observations and then difficult computations. And frankly, we didn't do a very good job. So we were stuck with dead reckoning. But if you take Clark's 1814 map of our tour and overlay it, as I'm told you can, with a map of your own time, you will find that it is astonishingly accurate, one of the great maps ever made of the American West. So altitude we couldn't do. That's more complicated. Here's what we knew about altitude. The Rockies are much higher than the Appalachians. We reckoned maybe 8,000 or 9,000 feet where we were, but we had no way of knowing for sure. Now here's the problem of the convergence. We did split up on the return journey on July 3rd, 1806, and we said we'll meet at the confluence of the Yellowstone and the Missouri. As you know, in what's now northwestern North Dakota, the two great rivers come together. One of the great places on Earth, the confluence of the Yellowstone and the Missouri, and we split up, and Clark was going to examine the Yellowstone and a few of its tributaries, and I was going to go back up to the Great Falls and the Marias because I needed to see the source of the Marias in the hopes that it was in Canada. Because, as you know, we were entitled to the entire Missouri watershed, and if the Missouri had a Canadian source, we could drive back the Canadian border, which I hope you will agree would be a highly desirable thing to have done. I don't know how you sleep at night knowing that the Canadians are as close as they are, but that's your own business. It must be your Calvinist temperament. So I was on the Marias, and Clark was on the Yellowstone, and we'd split the company into roughly, at first, 2 parts, and we were to meet at this confluence, and whoever got there first would wait. And we knew that it'd be in the fall sometime. I mean, that's sort of how we reckon time in Mr. Jefferson's America. We'll meet in the fall sometime. Imagine if you had to live that way. But that's all we had. We had absolutely no way of tracking each other from the moment that we split up. So what happened was, as you rightly say, it was a near simultaneous return. Clark returned to the confluence on August 3rd, 1806. I got there on August 7th, so 4 days later. But there's a little catch, and I want to tell the story, although it takes about 3 minutes. The idea was whoever got there first would wait. Clark got there first, and he discovered that the mosquitoes as he likes to call them, were so thick and annoying that he left a note in a tree saying, "I'm going downriver until I can find a breeze." So I get there on August 7th, having triumphed over the continent, and there's a note in a tree, and I send a man up to get it, and it says, it's from Clark, saying the mosquitoes are too troublesome, he's leaving. I will admit that I was annoyed. We have fought the grizzled bear. We have known starvation in the Bitterroot Mountains. We have had a near bloodbath with the Teton Sioux, and now a mosquito has driven my partner downriver. And now I, as the leader of the expedition, have to catch up, which I don't like. And this is not as funny as it seems, because when you miss each other at a key place, actually making a connection could be impossible. And what if Clark gets to St. Louis first? So I'm a little annoyed, but I don't show it because I'm Mr. Jefferson's protege. And I had one more thing that I richly needed to do, and that is to determine the latitude of the place on the Missouri where the Missouri gets as close as it's ever going to get to the North Pole. If you think about it, see if I can do this from your perspective. If this is southwestern Montana here, where my fist is, the source of the river, it goes east and makes a big bend towards Canada, and then it turns in North Dakota south and goes down to Kansas City and then east again to its mouth. And so I'm sure you can sense that there is a place somewhere where it gets as close to the North Pole as it's ever going to get, and it's important to know that for the reasons that I've already stated about the boundaries. I had to have its latitude, and of course I couldn't have determined it on the way out because we didn't know then that this was the northernmost place. So this is a key moment, and I have to have it. And if I don't have it, in some sense the expedition has failed. But now that Clark has gone on, I can't linger very long, can I? I have to catch up, so I've got a problem. So I said to the men on August 11th, 1806, I said, "Men, I want you to row like the Argonauts of the old world." And they did, and it was one of their best days, and they rowed like the wind, and we got to this place, I called it the Burnt Hills, at 12:20 p.m. And if you know anything about this, you have to be there at high noon, and if you miss it, you can't do it. So now I have the choice of either stopping for another day, and I don't have another day, or failing to fulfill this order from Mr. Jefferson. So now I'm really upset. And I turned to Pierre Cruzat, our best boatman and our fiddler, and I said to him, "Let's go hunting." Now you need to know a few things about this. First of all, and I don't mean this to sound glib, but Pierre Cruzat was almost entirely blind. He was totally blind in one eye and very nearsighted in the other. Number two, we were both wearing skins by now, elk skins, and we were hunting for elk in a thick willow thicket. So why I chose Cruzat, I don't know, but I have regretted it every day since. So we go into this elk thicket on a sandbar, and I shot an elk, but it was bleeding and wandering through the brush, and I got down on my hands and knees to follow it. And then a shot rang out, and I was struck in the buttocks. This was about a .54 caliber ball, so half an inch, and it went entirely through one buttock and creased the other to an inch in depth. I knew immediately what had happened. Fortunately, the ball had struck neither artery nor bone, and so it was by no means mortal, but it hurt like hell, and it made me very unhappy. And I shouted out, "Damn you, you rascal, you have shot me." But he did not reply. And now I began to fear an attack, an ambush by the Assiniboines. So I called out the men, and they scoured the area in full military formation. And I was wounded, and I tried to crawl back to the boat, and eventually I collapsed, my wounds stiffened, but I had pistols with me, and I prepared to sell my life just as dearly as possible. But nothing came of it, and finally, after about half an hour, they came out of the thickets with poor Pierre Cruzat, and he was brought in front of me, and he was trembling like an aspen leaf. And when asked, he said that he shot what he took to be an elk, but he could not be sure. Well, my wound healed within about a month. I was, on September 9th, Clark said I was walking and even running almost as well as ever. But I will say this is not how I expected to come home. I wanted to come home as Captain Cook. And instead I was shot in the ass by my own man. And if you know anything about wounds in my time, they were deliberately kept open so that they would heal from the inside out. So it was suppurating, and there was lint, and lint is a form of medical separator, but it was very ugly and humiliating business. And it's not my sense of who I am or how I return to civilization after 28 months in the wild. And so this was symbolic of a kind of collapse at the end of the expedition, and we didn't get the latitude, and that leaves a hole in the science of our tour. I'll take one more question, and then we'll quit. Yes, sir.
In view of your comment about Canada, I have a question for you about your preparation and the things you've read, and I'm particularly interested in the voyage of Alexander Mackenzie, who was, some people here may know, did a similar voyage to you, Mr. Clark, did in a fourth of time with a third of the people.
Well, citizen, may I call you citizen? I think if Mr. Jefferson were here, he would say we disagree, but as rational friends. Yes, of course we knew of Mackenzie's failed mission across Canada. You know, Mackenzie went in 1793, and if you've read Mr. Jefferson's correspondence, you know well that Jefferson said that it was an impractical route because it was frozen for much of the year, and, said Jefferson, quote, an infinite number of portages. So yes, it was a kind of a feat, but it was meaningless from a geopolitical point of view or commercial. And Jefferson said that if we can find a temperate climate water route across the continent, we will have done a service to everyone, including our British friends. And I will also remind you that at the end of Mackenzie's book, Voyages from Montreal, published in 1801, Mackenzie, in his last paragraph, says that the British, a mercantilist nation, should fund the fur trade in that region, including in the American side of it. And in doing so, says Mackenzie, it could monopolize the trade with the Indians and keep the Yankees out of their own region of the Northwest. So that was provocation enough for Mr. Jefferson to rush our tour into existence. And so I would just ask you this. If you had the choice between following my tour along the Missouri and Columbia or scrambling over rocky hillsides in Canada, I leave it to you to determine which is the better route, sir. Thank you. I so appreciate your generous applause. We're going to take 10 more minutes total, so I promise that it won't go on endlessly. I just want to break character for a moment and quickly introduce myself. My name is Clay Jenkinson, and the last time I was here was a couple of years ago when I had the chance as President Jefferson to address the International Samuel Johnson Society, whose works I see behind me. Jefferson was no friend to Johnson. Johnson would not have liked Jefferson. That was another time. But Richard Wendorf and I have known each other for a long time now, and I'm always just thrilled to have a chance to come here. And this time I come with a special purpose because, as you know, the exhibit here is one produced by Lewis and Clark College. I have an affiliation there. I'm a scholar in residence there, and it's a very interesting exhibit here, and we're so glad that the Athenaeum wanted to have it. It's an exhibit of mostly of the traveling library of Lewis and Clark. They were not only the writingest explorers of all time, but they may have been the readingest explorers of all time, and they were traveling with a large number of important reference works, most of them dedicated to pure science, binomial classification, astronomics to determine latitude and longitude and so on. But they had a 4-volume dictionary, Owen's Dictionary of Arts and Sciences, and so on. So it was really interesting, and the exhibit we're very proud of, and I hope you've had a chance to look at it, and if not, I hope you will. But I just wanted to say a couple more things. First of all, to go back to the last question for just a second. It was a very shrewd question, and the reason why I answered it with some acerbity as Lewis is that it was a sticking point. It was a very sore issue with Jefferson. And in a way, if most of you are old enough to remember this, in a way the Mackenzie publication in 1801 of Voyages from Montreal was like Sputnik in 1957. I mean, it scared the living daylights out of Thomas Jefferson because he thought he was about to lose the West. And so he rushed this expedition into the field, and it was one of the most brilliantly planned expeditions in American history. Its front end was actually much more brilliantly done than its back end. But Jefferson wanted Lewis to know that book, and he very much wanted to compete with Mackenzie, and that's one reason why Jefferson was so upset after the expedition when the publication project bogged down. As you know, they came back in September of 1806, but the book, the Nicholas Biddle's paraphrase of the journey, did not appear until 1814, so fully 8 years after their return. This is an unconscionable length of time for Jefferson. And when it finally appeared, it's a very interesting story. When it finally appeared in 1814, it had been stripped of its science. The science had been offloaded, and it was going to be handled by Benjamin Smith Barton, who never did it. And so Lewis's science was entirely forgotten throughout the 19th century, and all the things that he discovered were rediscovered by others and named under their lights. And so Lewis really lost his place as the Audubon of American natural science because of this terrible set of circumstances following his death, and he died probably by suicide on October 11th, 1809. So the Mackenzie voyage was Sputnik for Jefferson, and Lewis and Clark followed the protocol of Mackenzie quite deliberately. For example, Mackenzie traveled with a Newfoundland dog. Lewis traveled with a Newfoundland dog. When Mackenzie got to the coast, he wrote Alexander Mackenzie by land and the date. Clark wrote, scratched into a tree, a very similar statement at the Pacific Ocean. So they were clearly living in the shadow of Mackenzie. And of course, they won, didn't they? Because now, if you're following this national phenomenon, whatever it is about Lewis and Clark, you don't hear the word Mackenzie very often. You know, that Lewis and Clark have really taken this story, and Mackenzie is mostly forgotten. Zebulon Pike is mostly forgotten, even though he was doing two explorations equally interesting in some regards at the same time. Hunter and Dunbar in Arkansas are mostly forgotten. Thomas Freeman in Texas, a man much greater than Lewis and Clark and arguably greater than Jefferson. Alexander von Humboldt was traveling throughout Central and South America during this period, mostly unknown. So Lewis and Clark have grabbed a market share of this story that is entirely out of keeping with, I think, their rightful place. But of course, I'm perfectly happy as a Lewis and Clark scholar to see that happen. But I have a reading list if you're interested, if you want to read more. I also lead cultural tours up and down the Lewis and Clark Trail, and if you're interested in that, I have a brochure for that. And I just gave a copy of my new book to Richard. I had the I've written three on Lewis and Clark now, one called The Character of Meriwether Lewis, another one called The Lewis and Clark Companion, which I wrote with Stephanie Ambrose Tubbs, Stephen Ambrose's daughter. And then finally, just out, is an edition that I produced of Lewis and Clark in North Dakota. And the reason I'm so proud of it, and I can boast about it, is because I did it pro bono, so I can never make a dime on this. But the reason I'm so proud of it is that it's, and Richard will appreciate this, it's real scholarship. Most of what I do is secondary, tertiary, or worse kind of work, where you just kind of trotting out stuff you read somewhere, which is important, but it's not scholarship the way that we were trained long ago. And this is real scholarship. It's an edition. It involves textual, establishing the text. It involves fundamental annotation of the text. And so it was so great in midlife to do a project of that sort of fundamentals. And now lowly little North Dakota, where I'm from, has the only state-based edition of Lewis and Clark. And furthermore, this edition has every journal keeper every day on the day that he wrote it. If you know anything about this, if you read the National Definitive Edition by Gary Moulton, if you want to find out what happened on any given day, you have to go to several different volumes, because they have Lewis and Clark first, and then Ordway much later, and Gass somewhere else, and Whitehouse somewhere. And so if you want to find out what happened on November 11th, 1804, when Sacagawea first comes to Fort Mandan, you have to look at 6 volumes of Moulton, which even for a scholar is a bit much. But in this edition that we produced through the State Historical Society of North Dakota, every journal keeper, every day on the day that he wrote it, you get a multi-perspective right there. And so this is something that I just thought up one day, and now that I did it, it just seems so obvious. But North Dakota now has this claim, and the reason I'm going on and on about this is not only that I'm proud of this work, but North Dakota needs this work. Think of what you have historically. We have just 2 stories, Lewis and Clark and Lawrence Welk. That's all we've got, You choose, So North Dakota's counting on the bicentennial as its moment. If you've been reading the New York Times, you know how the outmigration in North Dakota is just unendurable. And so this is a big thing for North Dakota, and I urge you all to buy it as a patriotic act. And if you're interested, I have materials about that. I've so enjoyed this, and we've barely scratched the surface, but let me just quickly recommend to you, if you want to read more, I have a list on my bibliography, but the book that, of course, that you ought to read is Stephen Ambrose's Undaunted Courage. It remains the best 1-volume treatment ever, and it reads like a novel, and it's full and comprehensive, and no one quibbles with the details except gunsmiths. Find some faults here and there with but I had some trouble with gunsmiths in my own edition. So that's, I recommend. And then if you're interested in digging in from a humanities perspective, and that's where I really come to this, is as a humanities scholar, not a historian. If you're interested in the humanities, read James Ronda's Lewis and Clark Among the Indians. Lewis and Clark Among the Indians was published in the 1980s. It's the first time ever in the course of Lewis and Clark studies that someone asked, well, what do you think the Indians thought about all this? And so it's just a revolutionary book and a marvelous one, and I urge you to take a look at that. And then just very recently, there's a new book by the Missouri Historical Society, produced by a woman named Carolyn Gilman. And it's a fabulous book, and it's on this list. So if you're interested, there are websites aplenty, and my website, which has these lists for Jefferson and Lewis and others, is www.th-jefferson.org. So thanks to Richard, thanks to all of you.